Frumess talks about Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. Let's all talk about Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
Vampire in Brooklyn from 1995, directed by Wes Craven. This is the movie he made right before he would make Scream. This revisit is a long time coming. I'm not quite sure when I last saw it, possibly in the 90s or the super early 2000s. Overall, the 90s had a seriously great vampire renaissance. And that's true, man. When you look at the 90s, I mean, the 80s had some incredible vampire classics between Lost Boys and Fright Night. And I don't know what else off the top of my head. I'm trying to think from the 80s that was. I mean, really, those are the two. Those are the two really, really big ones. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. What from the 80s that was a vampire movie? No, it was like Fright Night, and Fright Night and Lost Boys. Those are, oh, and I guess Near Dark would be another one too. But there's not a lot of them. But then in the 90s comes around and holy fuck, you have Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula came out. You had Interview with a Vampire. You had From Dusk Till Dawn, Bordello of Blood. You had Blood and Donuts as a great one. That's a lesser known one, but that's a great one. You have John Carpenter's Vampires. You had that was kind of no, that was pretty people like that movie, but really From Dusk Till Dawn, man. Oh my freaking god! And Bram Stoker's Dracula. You had Dracula Dead and Loving It, Mel Brooks's sort of laugh riot Dracula adaptation. And then on the flip side, you had Wes Craven doing Vampire in Brooklyn with Eddie Murphy and Angela Bassett, man. I mean, what a pedigree that is. It's just amazing how many tons of now iconic and memorable vampire movies came out of the decade, and some of them have remarkable staying power. I think about Bram Stoker's Dracula, Interview with a Vampire, and of course, From Dusk Till Dawn. This was not one of them. Vampire in Brooklyn is actually kind of a panned movie on many different levels. People that like it really like it. It's messy. In fact, it's typically panned across the board. I never personally understood why, but I also haven't seen it in forever. I love Eddie Murphy and I love Wes Craven. It's sort of crazy to me that overall this movie doesn't really gel. It's messy, to say the least. I mean, the story and the characters are all over the place. The movie can't decide on what its tone should be. When you hear about the behind the scenes, it becomes more apparent. It's not widely agreed on whether Eddie Murphy was trying to make comedy horror or Wes Craven was trying to make a horror comedy. And that goes back to what I was saying before. You have to ride that line so fine. Look at how Reanimator does it. Reanimator's comedy, same thing with Return of the Living Dead. How do those movies function as horror comedies or comedy horror films? The performances, the tone is of the utmost serious. Like there's no slapstick in those. There is slapstick, but the slapstick is accidental. The slapstick actually comes by the way of violence, because much like horror and comedy are sort of like a dynamic contrast, so too is slapstick and violence. And same thing with Evil Dead. The original, when you look at the original Evil Dead, it's like these films are laugh out loud funny because of how serious they're being taken, and violence gets pushed to such a level that it becomes funny. It becomes slapsticky, in that kind of way. It becomes over the top, or it's just done with the craziness of it all. When you look at Return of the Living Dead, when you look at some of the scenes in Return of the Living Dead, and you go, it goes from being absolutely terrifying to absolutely hilarious in the craziness of trying to cremate a dead body and trying to convince a mortician that they're to use their crematorium because they have rabid weasels. Vampire in Brooklyn never finds it. It's a comedy with tons of violence in it. That's really what it is. But it just doesn't work. The scenes don't work. There's no story. The story is so, I don't know, discombobulated, man. And so, you know, it's funny. Wes Craven immediately made Scream following this film and perfected the formula in the process. And what helped him to do that was the lessons he learned on Vampire in Brooklyn. By the way, some more incredible vampire films from the 90s. You have Innocent Blood by John Landis, even though John Landis is a piece of shit. More on him in a second. And you also have The Addiction, right? You have The Addiction by Abe Ferreira. Oh, and you have Habit by Larry Fessenden, which we reviewed last year, which blew me away from 96, which I had never seen. I mean, just so many great vampire films. What I found most interesting is Vampire in Brooklyn is basically Eddie Murphy with a screenplay written by his brother Charlie Murphy remaking Coming to America, but blending it with the story of Dracula. So literally Vampire in Brooklyn is just Coming to America with vampires. That's the story. That's literally the story. On paper, that should work just fine, except that it doesn't. Three other thoughts came to me while watching this movie. Number one, these are kind of like rhetorical questions too, I would say. Is remaking Coming to America with Wes Craven supposed to be a subtle fuck you to John Landis and their strained relationship? Also, fuck you, John Landis. And if you don't know why I'm saying fuck you, John Landis, just go Google his segment on the Twilight Zone and how he is a piece of human shit. Number two, in a hot take that no one is asking for, Max, played by Eddie Murphy, spoilers, is 100% Rita's father. Rita is played by Angela Bassett. Their race of vampires died out, and desperate Max is trying to seduce his daughter, but playing it off like he knew her father in a Return of the Jedi, Obi-Wan Kenobi backtracking his wording to Luke in A New Hope about his father being quote unquote dead, if that makes any sense. So it almost feels like, you know how like in A New Hope, he's like, yeah, your father was killed by Darth Vader. But then in like Return of the Jedi, Luke's like, why'd you lie to me? And he's like, oh, well, your father was technically symbolically dead, but you know, he just really transformed, blah, 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 whatever, you know, that sort of thing. And in this movie, it almost, you know, this is just what I surmise from watching it is that Max is the father, but he's trying to play it off like he isn't because he doesn't want to freak out his daughter, and he's trying to jumpstart his vampire race again. I don't know, really weird. Number three, Kadeem Hardison, who you might also know, who played Dwayne in A Different World, the sitcom from the black sitcom from the 90s, beloved sitcom from the 90s. He plays Julius Jones in full. So him playing Julius Jones, the character in Vampire in Brooklyn, in full ghoul makeup would have also worked smashingly well with Nicolas Cage as Dracula, because Julius Jones is the equivalent of Renfield. And I would have loved to have seen Julius Jones paired up with Nicolas Cage's Dracula in Renfield or some other movie. I think it would have worked really, really well. I would have liked to have seen that.